The chandeliers glowed like falling stars above the marble ballroom, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and diamond-studded gowns. Manhattan's elite moved through the air of music and laughter, every corner brimming with wealth and pride. Waiters carried trays of champagne that caught the glitter of gold in their flutes, while conversation sparkled with the same arrogance as the jewels flashing on wrists and necks. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, the man everyone either envied or feared. He wore confidence like a perfectly tailored suit, his dark eyes scanning the room with the ease of a predator who knew no one could challenge him. To Ethan, life was a board game, and people were pieces waiting to be moved. Victor Hale, his closest companion and rival in arrogance, approached with that knowing smirk that always meant trouble. They had grown together in wealth and status, the wolves in a world of sheep, feeding on deals and destroying competitors without ever flinching. Victor leaned in, swirling his champagne lazily. "Ethan, my friend," he drawled, "you win every time. Money, women, power. There isn't a soul in this room who doesn't already know you'll get whatever you want. But tell me what happens when the game isn't made for you to win." Ethan arched a brow, amused. "You've been drinking too much, Victor. There isn't a game I can't win." Victor's grin widened, and he gestured subtly across the ballroom. Ethan followed the motion of his hand until his eyes landed on her. Amelia Grant. She stood by the far wall, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, unbothered by the spectacle swirling around her. She was different, not dressed in the sleek gowns of the others, her body fuller, her figure ridiculed by the shallow whispers of those who measured worth by appearance. Yet, she stood with a kind of quiet dignity, her chin lifted, her presence radiating a strange calm that clashed against the storm of vanity around her. Victor leaned close to Ethan's ear, his words meant to sting. "I bet you couldn't last 6 months married to her. Not your type, not your trophy. She'd break you before you could bend her." The challenge burned in the air. Ethan straightened, his pride flaring hot. "And what's the prize for this absurd little game?" Victor raised his glass, eyes glittering with mischief. $2 million. Winner takes it all. But it's not the money, is it? It's the glory of proving me wrong. Around them, laughter swelled, oblivious to the wager being born in the shadows of ego. Ethan's jaw tightened, his heart thrumming with the thrill of competition. He lived for these moments, the chance to prove, to dominate, to walk away with victory carved into his name. Without hesitation, he nodded. 6 months, consider it done. The next evening, in a turn that shocked everyone, Ethan Caldwell crossed the ballroom floor to Amelia. Whispers erupted like sparks as he approached her, the room holding its collective breath. Amelia looked up, her eyes steady, not flustered by his reputation or the sudden weight of attention. "Miss Grant," Ethan said smoothly, his voice carrying both charm and arrogance. "I have a proposition for you. Marry me." The room gasped. Victor's laughter echoed softly from across the hall, but Amelia didn't flinch. She studied Ethan in silence, her eyes calm, sharp, assessing for a long moment. It was as though she could see beyond the surface, past the tailored suit and the wealth, past the arrogance he wore like armor. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she answered, "Yes." Her voice was even, firm, carrying no trace of hesitation. Yet her eyes, those eyes held a secret Ethan couldn't decipher, something deeper than the room, deeper than the bet, deeper than the power he thought he wielded. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt an unfamiliar stir in his chest. He had won the first move, but somehow, in the calm acceptance of her reply, he sensed that the game had already shifted and that he might not be the one holding the pieces. The wedding happened faster than anyone could have imagined. One moment, Ethan Caldwell was the golden bachelor of Manhattan, and the next, newspapers printed photographs of him, standing beside Amelia Grant, a woman who seemed to belong to another world entirely. Society whispered, laughed, speculated. Some said it was a publicity stunt. Others claimed Ethan had gone mad. To most, Amelia was a puzzle piece that didn't fit into Ethan's picture-perfect life, but Ethan didn't care. To him, this was still just another game of bet he intended to win. The ceremony itself was as cold as a business contract. There were no grand vows spoken with trembling voices, no lingering kisses to prove affection. The exchange was brief, transactional. Amelia wore a modest dress that flattered her, but wasn't dripping in designer fabric. She carried herself with quiet strength, ignoring the sea of eyes waiting for her to falter. Ethan, standing tall in a tailored tuxedo, offered her his arm with the smugness of a man convinced of his eventual triumph. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, he didn't see Amelia as a partner, but as a challenge to conquer. That evening, Ethan escorted her to his glass-walled penthouse towering over the glittering city. It was his castle, his throne, filled with imported art and handcrafted furniture that screamed of power and success. He expected Amelia to be overwhelmed, impressed, silenced by wealth. Instead, she walked through the massive rooms with unhurried steps, her eyes calm, almost disinterested. When she reached the window, the city lights spread out beneath them like diamonds scattered across velvet. She studied it quietly, then spoke in a voice that cut through the stillness. 6 months. Ethan, not a day more. And don't mistake this for your victory. I'm not here to be won. Her words lingered in the air like smoke. Ethan laughed softly, trying to mask the unease her confidence stirred within him. You'll change your mind. Everyone does eventually, but Amelia didn't answer. She simply turned back to the window, her reflection staring at him through the glass steady. Unshaken, the days that followed became a battlefield disguised as domestic life. Ethan's weapons were diamonds, silk, and luxury. He ordered designers to craft wardrobes for her, brought home jewelry in velvet boxes, reserved tables in Michelin-star restaurants where chefs prepared dishes as rare as jewels. Yet, every offering was met with the same calm refusal. She thanked him politely, but her eyes remained unbent. Instead of lavish dinners, she preferred her tea brewed strong, without sugar. Instead of designer dresses, she wore her own simple clothes. It drove Ethan mad. He was used to women folding beneath his wealth, surrendering to the lifestyle he dictated. Amelia, however, lived by her own rules, untouched by the glitter he surrounded her with. The more she refused, the more determined Ethan became to break through her armor. His pride was on the line. This wasn't about victory anymore, it was about control. One evening, frustrated by her steady resistance, Ethan tried a different approach. Why did you agree? He asked, his tone sharp, demanding an answer. You know what this is. You know who I am, so why accept? Amelia's gaze locked onto his, unwavering. I have my reasons. But don't fool yourself, Ethan. I didn't agree because of you. Her answer gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about it. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes wide open, with a secret hidden beneath her calm exterior, and that knowledge unsettled him in a way no business rival ever had. At the same time, their clashes began to intensify. At breakfast, Amelia dismantled his arrogance with sharp, cutting truths that left him speechless. At dinners, she parried his provocations with wit, turning his attempts at dominance into hollow gestures. Each time she spoke, it was as if she peeled another layer off the image of himself he had so carefully constructed. One night, after returning late from a business meeting, Ethan found her in the living room, reading a book with quiet focus. The sight of her serene, untouchable ignited something between anger and fascination inside him. You act like none of this matters, he said, pacing in front of her, motioning at the walls. The wealth, the life he had built. As if, my world means nothing. Amelia closed her book slowly and looked up at him with eyes that carried storms. Because it doesn't. You can fill this place with all the treasures of the earth, Ethan, but it's empty. Do you know why? Because you are. The words struck deeper than he expected, leaving him silent. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell had no response. That night, he lay awake, staring at the city skyline through the glass. The penthouse no longer felt like his fortress, it felt like a cage. Amelia's words echoed in his mind. Empty. The man who conquered companies, who crushed competitors, who bent people to his will, was he truly nothing more than a hollow shell? As the weeks passed, Ethan began to realize something dangerous. This wasn't just a game anymore. Amelia Grant wasn't playing by his rules. She had brought her own, and he couldn't see the end game. He was used to controlling the board. But this time, he had walked into someone else's strategy, and when he caught Amelia one morning, standing by the window again, looking down at the city with that same unreadable calm, he saw it clearly for the first time. She wasn't here to be conquered. She was here to conquer him. The days inside Ethan Caldwell's penthouse began to feel like a war fought in silence, where neither side raised weapons, but both carried sharpened wills. The gleaming glass walls reflected not just the skyline of Manhattan, but the growing fracture inside the walls of their marriage. Every morning began with a clash, subtle words, looks that cut, The heavy quiet of two people circling each other like predators waiting for the other two. Falter. Ethan tried everything to reclaim the sense of control that had always defined him. He canceled Amelia's volunteer schedules, telling her she didn't need to waste time with common people. He arranged meetings she never agreed to, social gatherings where he expected her to appear at his side like a polished ornament. But Amelia refused each attempt with unnerving calm. "I'm not an accessory, Ethan," she said one night when he tried to persuade her into wearing a sequin gown for a gala. "You can parade diamonds, but not me." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. For the first time, Ethan's charm and wealth weren't enough to bend someone to his will. The tension between them became a storm. At breakfast, she sat across from him sipping tea in silence, unbothered by the weight of his glare. At dinners, she countered his arrogant remarks with a steady wit that left him unsettled. The more he tried to provoke, the more she stripped his words bare, forcing him to confront an emptiness he had never acknowledged. One evening, desperation pushed Ethan to lash out with a cruel question. "Do you enjoy this, Amelia? Playing the rebel wife? You'll walk away in 6 months, but what then? Who else would want you?" The room grew painfully still. Amelia lowered her fork and looked at him not with anger, but with a sadness that pierced deeper than rage. "You think beauty is measured by thinness and dresses, Ethan. That's why you'll never understand me. You see my body as a weapon against me, but I see it as proof I've lived, proof I've endured. You only see the surface because you're too afraid to look deeper." For the first time in his life, Ethan felt ashamed. Her words forced him into silence, and silence was something he had always used as his weapon. Now, she wielded it against him. The following week, Ethan noticed changes around him. Meetings at his firm were disrupted by small but devastating errors, contracts misplaced, calls rescheduled without explanation. A deal he had spent months negotiating suddenly collapsed. When the client pulled out with vague excuses, Ethan raged at his assistants. But a quiet suspicion gnawed at him. Was Amelia somehow behind this? He began to watch her more closely. At night, when she sat by the window with her books, her phone glowed in her hand. She spoke in hushed tones to people he didn't recognize. Once, he caught the edge of a name, a man whose company Ethan remembered crushing years ago in one of his ruthless takeovers. It chilled him. Was she connected to them? Was she orchestrating something larger? One night, unable to contain himself, Ethan confronted her. "What are you doing, Amelia? Who are you talking to?" She closed her book and set it on the table. With deliberate calm, "Does it matter, Ethan? You don't own me. You never did. I'm your husband." He shot back, his voice rising. Her eyes sharpened, cutting through the arrogance in his tone. "No, you're my jailer who locked himself in with me, and you don't even realize it yet." Those words left Ethan reeling. For the first time, he wondered if he was truly the player or the piece being moved. That night he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Amelia's words echoed through him, planting a seed of fear. He had walked into this marriage thinking it was a bet. He would easily win, a game of pride and wealth. But slowly, unbearably, the roles were reversing. She wasn't bending to him, she was reshaping him. And then came the night that changed everything. Ethan arrived home late from a dinner with Victor, his so-called friend, who had been watching the bet unfold with wicked amusement. When Ethan stepped into the penthouse, he heard Amelia's voice, soft, serious, through the slightly open balcony door. He froze. She wasn't on the phone. She was recording something, her words deliberate, powerful, filled with pain that cut through the night air. "My father lost everything because of men like Ethan Caldwell. Because greed devoured honesty, because cruelty became the currency of business. But this time, I will not stay silent. I will make him face the truth, even if it destroys him." Ethan's blood turned to ice. He realized then that Amelia wasn't just resisting him. She was dismantling him piece by piece, brick by brick. The empire he thought untouchable wasn't being attacked from the outside. It was collapsing from within, and Amelia was at the center of it all. He stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, his chest heaving, a chill spreading through his veins. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell, the man who believed he was untouchable, felt fear, and Amelia, calm and resolute, was the reason why. The storm finally broke on a rain-soaked evening when the city below glistened like broken glass. Ethan returned to the penthouse, drenched not from the weather, but from the weight pressing on his chest. For weeks he had lived, with gnawing suspicion, catching fragments of Amelia's secret conversations, sensing the quiet precision of her movements. She was no longer just his defiant wife, she was a presence that haunted him, a shadow that seemed to know every crack in his armor. That night, she was waiting for him. She stood near the window in her plain dress, her hair pulled back, the city lights framing her like a halo of fire. She didn't greet him. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough to make him feel like an intruder in his own home. Ethan poured himself a drink, his hands unsteady. "I heard you," he said finally, his voice low, almost unrecognizable to himself. "That night on the balcony, you spoke about your father, about men like me. What did you mean?" Amelia turned slowly, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. "You want answers, Ethan? You'll get them, but understand this, the truth won't break me. It will break you." The air between them tightened like a noose. Ethan had faced boardrooms filled with men who wanted to see him fail, had stared down competitors who plotted his downfall, but nothing had ever unnerved him like the calm in her voice. She walked toward him, each step deliberate, her presence filling the room with a gravity he couldn't escape. "Do you remember the Grant Manufacturing Company?" she asked, her tone sharp. Ethan frowned, searching his memory. The name stirred something, but it was buried under the endless list of companies he had gutted for profit. He shook his head. "I've crushed 100 companies. Why should I remember one?" Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Because it wasn't just a company. It was my father's life, his blood, his sweat, his only legacy." Ethan's breath caught. The pieces began to fall into place, jagged and merciless. "You wanted expansion into steel fabrication. My father's company was small, honest, holding the contract you coveted. You swooped in, manipulated the market, undercut him until he had nothing left. Within months, he lost his business, his home, and eventually his will to live." Her voice broke on those last words, and for the first time, Ethan saw tears glisten in her eyes, not weakness, but the raw memory of a wound that never healed. "My father died because of you," Amelia whispered, "and while I buried him with my own hands, you were celebrating another victory, another notch in your empire. Do you understand now why I said yes to your proposal? Why I walked into this marriage with my head held high? This was never about money, Ethan. This was about justice." The room spun around him. Ethan staggered back, his drink slipping from his fingers, the glass shattering across the marble floor. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, his words strangled. He had never thought about the faces behind the companies he destroyed. To him, they were names on contracts, numbers on spreadsheets, obstacles to be erased. But now, one of those faces was staring at him with unflinching eyes, living proof of the destruction he left behind. Amelia stepped closer, her voice steady again, cutting through his silence. "You thought this was a bet, a game between you and Victor. But you've been the pawn, Ethan. Every move you made, every attempt to control me, has only shown me how shallow you really are. And now I want you to feel the weight of what you've done. I want you to drown in it." Her words struck harder than any physical blow. Ethan felt his chest ache, his breath uneven. For the first time in years, he was not the master of the game, he was the prisoner. The rain outside intensified, streaking the glass with rivers of light. Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the arrogance stripped from him like a mask torn away. He saw images he had buried, the boardrooms where he smirked while men begged him for mercy, the signatures that ended livelihoods, the parties where he toasted to victories built on other people's losses. It all flooded back, merciless and heavy-eyed. Amelia watched him crumble, her eyes cold but not cruel. "Do you feel it now?" she asked quietly. "Do you finally understand that money doesn't make you powerful, it makes you blind? You destroy lives for your empire, and the difference between us, Ethan, is that I carry scars, but you carry emptiness." He lifted his gaze, his face pale, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you just expose me? Why this? Why marry me?" Amelia's answer was sharp, unwavering. "Because I wanted you to see me, not as a woman you thought was beneath you, not as a body you mocked in your mind, but as the daughter of the man you destroyed. I wanted you to look into my eyes every day and know that your victories had consequences." Ethan's heart pounded painfully in his chest. For the first time in his life, he had no defense, no escape. He was trapped not by contracts or rivals, but by truth. And then, as if delivering the final blow, Amelia whispered, "This isn't the whole truth, Ethan. There's more. When the time is right, you'll hear it. And when you do, you'll never be the same again." She turned away, leaving him alone with the thunder outside and the ruin inside. Ethan sat frozen, consumed by dread. He had thought he was playing a game, but Amelia was weaving something much larger, something that reached into the darkest corners of his past. And if this was only part of the truth, then the rest, whatever it was, would destroy him. The days that followed Amelia's revelation twisted into something Ethan had never experienced before. His penthouse, once a monument to victory, now felt like a mausoleum. Every corner whispered with echoes of her words. He found himself haunted by the image of her father, a man he couldn't remember, but whose ruin was carved into Amelia's soul. The silence between them became unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was heavy with truths Ethan feared she still hadn't spoken. Amelia moved through the space like a shadow and a flame all at once. She did not scream. She did not rage. Instead, she carried herself with the composure of someone who knew the power of patience. And in that patience, Ethan felt the cracks in his arrogance widening. One night, as he sat alone in his office with the city spread out below like 1,000 diamonds mocking him, Amelia entered without knocking. She stood tall, her presence filling the room more than the shelves of leather-bound books or the abstract paintings he had bought for millions. Ethan straightened, tension gripping his chest. "You think you've heard the worst," she said, her voice calm yet laced with something darker. "But the truth has layers, Ethan, and you've only peeled away one." Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry. "Then tell me," he demanded, though the tremor in his tone betrayed his fear. "Tell me everything." Her eyes studied him for a long moment. "Not yet. You're not ready." The answer enraged him. "Not ready? I've built empires from nothing. I fought men who would bleed me dry. I'm always ready." Amelia stepped closer until she was just a breath away, her eyes boring into his. "That's your problem. You think readiness is about control, but this isn't about control. This is about reckoning." She turned and left him with those words, her footsteps fading into silence. From that night on, Ethan could no longer sleep. He replayed every deal, every ruthless decision. Faces he had forgotten appeared in his mind like specters. Businessmen begging for extensions he denied, workers whose jobs evaporated when he cut costs, families displaced by his acquisitions. For the first time, he saw them not as numbers, but as people, and each one chipped away at the man he thought he was. But Amelia wasn't finished. She began to strike in subtle ways that unsettled him even more. His schedule started unraveling. Important calls mysteriously canceled, investors growing cold without explanation. A project he had promised would cement his dominance in the industry collapsed. When a key partner backed out, Ethan raged at his staff, but deep down he felt Amelia's hand in it. She was pulling strings he couldn't see, orchestrating a quiet collapse of the world he had built. One evening, after a particularly brutal day where he watched millions slip from his grasp, Ethan confronted her in the living room. She was seated on the couch with a book in her hand, her face serene in the warm lamplight. He stood over her, fist clenched. "You're destroying everything I built," he accused, his voice shaking with both fury and desperation. She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes without fear. "No, Ethan, I'm not destroying anything. I'm letting you feel the weight of your own destruction. Every empire falls. Yours is just falling from the inside, where it was always hollow." Her calmness broke him more than any argument could. He staggered back, collapsing into a chair. For the first time, he whispered something he never thought he'd admit. "I don't know who I am anymore." Amelia closed her book gently, set it aside, and leaned forward. Her gaze softened, but her words remained sharp. "You're finally asking the right question. But don't expect me to answer it for you. You'll have to strip yourself bare and see the truth of the man you've become." The days turned into weeks, and Ethan began to change in ways he didn't recognize. He stopped attending the endless parties and galas that once defined his nights. He found himself reading the reports of the companies he had crushed, tracing the ripple effects of his actions. He began making anonymous donations, small at first, then larger, as if trying to stitch wounds he could never fully heal. Amelia noticed. She said nothing, but her silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of disdain. but of observation. She was watching him, measuring him, and that unnerved him more than her anger ever had. But then came the moment that shattered what little ground he thought he had regained. On a cold night, the rain drumming against the windows, Amelia sat across from him at the dining table. She had been quiet all evening, her eyes distant, as though carrying the weight of something she hadn't yet released. Finally, she set down her fork and spoke, her voice steady, but laced with sorrow. "You know about my father, but there's something you don't know, something I've carried alone for years." Ethan froze, the glass in his hand trembling. "I was pregnant once," Amelia said, her words cutting through him like a blade. "Back when my father lost everything. When you destroyed his company, I was 19. The stress, the despair, it took everything from me, even the child I carried. Do you understand now, Ethan? You didn't just take my father, you took my future." The world collapsed around him in that instant. Ethan's heart pounded, his vision blurred, his breath came, shallow and uneven. The guilt he had been carrying multiplied until it felt unbearable. He gripped the table as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Amelia's eyes glistened, but her voice remained firm. "This is the truth you weren't ready for. Now you know why I walked into this marriage, why I've watched you with eyes that don't bend. You can't erase what you've done, Ethan. The question is, what will you do now that you finally see it?" Ethan couldn't answer. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The man who had conquered boardrooms, silenced rivals, and dominated markets sat hollow and trembling, broken open by the weight of one woman's truth. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell knew what it meant to lose not to Victor, not to another competitor, but to the ghosts of the lives he had destroyed. Ethan Caldwell had always believed that money could erase mistakes. For years, he'd wielded his fortune like a sword, cutting down enemies, silencing critics, and buying loyalty. But after Amelia's confession that she had lost her child, in the wreckage of his greed he realized that no sum of money could mend the fractures he had carved into her life. That night, when the words sank into him fully, he sat alone in the dark of his penthouse, staring at the skyline he once believed he owned. For the first time, the glittering towers didn't look like triumph. They looked like gravestones. Sleep abandoned him. The man who once carried arrogance like a second skin now wandered restless through the night, haunted by ghosts of faces he had forgotten, workers, families, business owners, and always Amelia's father, a shadow he had never known, but who now loomed in every corner of the room. In the days that followed, Ethan changed not in words, but in actions. The staff noticed it first. He no longer barked orders or demanded perfection in trivial things. Instead, he lingered over Amelia's presence, not forcing her attention, but quietly observing her routines. He began making small gestures, her tea waiting in the morning, her books moved gently back to the table when she forgot them on the couch, her umbrella placed by the door when rain was forecast. None of these erased what he had done, but they were cracks in his old armor, signs that the ruthless man was beginning to soften. Amelia noticed, though she said nothing. She still carried her distance like a shield, still looked at him with eyes that reminded him he was guilty. Yet there were moments, tiny, fleeting, when her silence no longer carried only disdain. Once, when he set a bouquet of peonies on the table, her favorite flower, she paused, lifted one, and pressed it to her nose. She didn't thank him, didn't smile, but she didn't discard them either. That single gesture lit a spark of hope in him, though he dared not voice it. But Ethan knew that small gestures wouldn't be enough. He needed to face the empire he had built on bones and ashes. And so, one morning, he called his driver, not to whisk him away to meetings of profit and expansion, but to take him to neighborhoods he had nearly forgotten, places where his decisions had left devastation. The first door he knocked on belonged to the Carter family, whose printing business he had destroyed years ago. The father answered, older, wearier, with suspicion in his eyes. When he saw Ethan, his face hardened. "What do you want?" Ethan bowed his head, his voice trembling. "To say I'm sorry, and to do something, anything to make it right." The man laughed bitterly, the sound heavy with years of pain. "Sorry, you bled us dry. My son works 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. My wife still cries at night. What do you think sorry fixes?" Ethan listened, and for once, he didn't defend himself. He didn't hide behind excuses. He stood there, feeling the weight of every word, It doesn't fix anything, he admitted. But I want to help rebuild. Not with a check you'll never see me again for, but with real support. With time, with effort. The man didn't accept immediately, but he didn't slam the door either. That alone was a beginning. From that day forward, Ethan poured himself into a new mission. He set up programs for small businesses, paid debts for families ruined by his acquisitions, and returned properties he had taken unjustly. Not as a grand show for headlines, he refused press coverage, but quietly. As a man determined to undo some of the rot he had spread, each evening he returned home exhausted, often finding Amelia by the window, watching the city as she always did. She said nothing, but he noticed the way her eyes lingered longer on him, as though weighing the sincerity of his transformation. One night, weeks into his journey, she finally spoke. "Why now, Ethan? After everything, why change now?" He sat across from her, his shoulders heavy, but his eyes steady. "Because I can't undo what I've done, but I can decide who I become, and if I spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, then maybe, just maybe, I'll be more than the monster you see when you look at me." Her lips tightened, but she didn't turn away. For the first time, she seemed to consider the possibility that he might not be the same man who once destroyed her world. But beneath the fragile progress lay a deeper tension, one that grew each day. Ethan could sense it in the way Amelia sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. There was another truth, something she hadn't yet told him. He felt it like a weight pressing on his chest. Every step forward only sharpened the question, what else was she hiding? The suspense gnawed at him until one stormy evening, when Amelia stood before him in the quiet of the penthouse. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a depth he had not seen before. "You've changed, Ethan," she said softly. "I see it, but you should know this isn't over. There's one more truth you need to hear, and when I tell you, it will decide everything, whether you fall apart completely or rise." The words hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had thought he'd heard the worst already, the loss of her father, the child she had once carried, but Amelia's tone told him there was more, something hidden in the depths of her silence that would shake the fragile progress they had built. He leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "Tell me," but Amelia only shook her head. "Not tonight. When the moment comes, you'll know. And when you hear it, Ethan, your soul will be laid bare." She walked away, leaving him staring into the darkened glass of the windows, where his own reflection looked back at him, a man unrecognizable, caught between ruin and redemption, waiting for a truth that might destroy him. The night of truth arrived without warning. Ethan Caldwell had spent weeks clawing back pieces of himself, trying to rebuild what greed had torn apart. His empire looked different now, not polished boardrooms and ruthless takeovers, but outreach, programs, new foundations, quiet reparations made to families who had once cursed his name. Every signature on a contract now felt like a prayer for forgiveness. Yet, for all his effort, Ethan knew his redemption hinged on only one person, Amelia. And Amelia remained a fortress. Her silence was softer now, less filled with venom, but still distant. She watched him like a scientist watches an experiment, curious, cautious, waiting to see if his change would last or collapse back into arrogance. Every night, he returned to the penthouse hoping for something more, but each time she withdrew before the conversation could deepen. Until one evening, when the city was quiet beneath a haze of fog, Amelia summoned him to the living room. She was standing by the piano, her hands resting lightly on its edge, her face pale, but resolute. Ethan's stomach knotted instantly. He knew this was it, the truth she had promised, the secret she had kept buried until now. "Sit," she said simply. He obeyed without protest, sinking into the leather chair across from her. The silence stretched so long that the ticking of the clock on the wall became deafening. Finally, Amelia's voice broke through, steady but heavy with sorrow. "I told you about my father. I told you about the child I lost. But there's one more truth you need to hear, Ethan, and it is the hardest of all." Ethan's pulse pounded in his temples. "Whatever it is, tell me. I can face it." Her eyes locked onto his, sharp and unwavering. "The child wasn't only mine, Ethan. It was yours." The words struck him like a blade. For a moment, his mind refused to process them. He blinked, his breath stuttering, his world tilting on its axis. "Mine," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Yes." Amelia's tone was calm but firm. "When you destroyed my father's business, when my life was ripped apart, I was 19, and I was carrying your child. Ethan's chest heaved as if the air itself had turned against him. His memories tumbled back in chaos years ago, a brief affair at a charity event. A woman whose name he barely remembered at the time. He had been careless, dismissive, and walked away without a second thought. But now, staring at Amelia, he realized with gut-wrenching clarity that she wasn't just the daughter of the man he destroyed. She was the woman he had abandoned, carrying the weight of his arrogance in the most devastating way possible. I didn't tell you then because I knew what you were, Amelia continued, her voice trembling now with the force of her buried pain. A man obsessed with power, with image. I knew you would never choose us, and when the stress, the despair, the shame of what you had done to my family consumed me, I lost that child. I buried that pain alone while you toasted another. Victory, tears burned Ethan's eyes, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak. His hands shook violently in his lap. God, Amelia, if I had known, she cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. Don't say that. You didn't know because you never cared to look. You never thought of the lives behind your deals, the hearts behind your profits. That child was more than just a loss. It was the proof of everything you chose not to see. Ethan collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, he wept without restraint, not for his empire, not for the money he had lost, but for the child he never held, the family he had destroyed, and the woman who had carried his sins. Longer than he could imagine, Amelia's voice softened then, though it was still laced with steel. I married you, Ethan, not because I wanted revenge alone. I married you to make you face what you had buried, to show you that your victories were built on bones, and to force you to decide what kind of man you truly are when the truth can't be escaped. The room seemed to close in on him, the weight of her words pressing him into the floor. But then, slowly, he lifted his head, his eyes red and raw, his voice broken, but resolute. I can never give that child back. I can never erase what I've done to you, to your father, to so many others. But I can promise you this, Amelia, I will spend every breath I have left trying to be the man I should have been from the start. Not for a bet, not for glory, but for you, for us, for the memory of what I destroyed. Amelia studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, she stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, she whispered, but tonight, for the first time, I believe you mean it. And in that moment, as Ethan held her hand against his cheek, he knew that redemption was not a destination, it was a journey, one that would never erase his sins, but one that might one day earn him a place beside the woman who had broken him, opened and forced him to see the man he truly was. The bet that began as arrogance and cruelty had become something neither Victor nor Ethan could have ever imagined. It was no longer about money or pride. It was about loss, love, and the fragile possibility of redemption. And as Amelia leaned into his arms, tears slipping down her face, Ethan understood that this was not the end of the game. This was the beginning of his soul's reckoning.